I was able to choose the lessons today because there's choices to be made before Sunday. And the prayer book offers at least two different choices of different propers you could use. And today, I hope you see a theme running through each lesson. It's, in my opinion, unmistakable. It's about food, and in particular, manna, as it relates to the people of faith. So in Exodus and in Psalm 78 and in John's Gospel, we hear three accounts about manna, or food. I must admit I've never spent much time worrying about food. As you can see from my girth, I've never worried that much, let alone the biblical term for food, which is manna. And I'll get to that in a moment. It is something that I've taken for granted, except those rare occasions like in seminary when I gave up a week's worth of lunches so that the school could feed the homeless nearby. But then again, I knew when I was to have my next meal. I've been on probably 500 diets and have repeated that over and over again, always realizing that I could always have another meal. But if we think about it, manna, food, plays an important part in our lives as Christians, but I get ahead of myself. Many years ago, I spent a long week in the Dominican Republic exploring opportunities for my parish in Florida to link up with that diocese for mutual ministry. For a week, I spent time with Father Poli, the senior and revered priest of the diocese, which the bishop asked to shepherd me around the diocese. And we visited schools, medical clinics, missions, parishes, and simply talking to people about what really mattered to them regarding faith and their call to share Christ in their communities. And then there was a moment during the week that caught me off guard that I will always remember. Father Pauly and I stopped for lunch in a small town not far from Santo Domingo. To my surprise, on the corner was a fast food chain that served hamburgers. Usually in the Dominican Republic, it's chicken, so I was looking forward to a hamburger. And so I was back home for a moment. And as we ordered the usual fare that is found in the States, I treated him to lunch. After the blessing in Spanish, I began to eat my cheeseburger and fries. He sipped his drink, but didn't touch the fries or his hamburger. I waited, and I waited, and I looked at him somewhat anxiously, thinking something was amiss. A cultural mistake on my part, perhaps. So I waited, and then I finally said, "Is your hamburger okay?" "Oh, it's fine," he said. And then, without any regret or fumbling for words in Spanish or English, Father Pauly said that he was saving his meal for his youngest daughter, who was celebrating her birthday that day. Of course, I brought another meal for him. But he took that first order home to his daughter as a gift for her birthday. Sometimes we read the stories of the Bible and perhaps lose the nuances that those stories hold for us, in part because we're first world citizens of this world, perhaps because culturally we're quite not on sync with understanding fully the implications of the stories we hear. The Exodus story today reveals a moment in the life of the Israelites who have been freed from bondage and servitude, only to be thrown into a wilderness experience where they lack the bare necessities of life in the Sinai desert. This is soon after they have been released. And what did they do immediately? They complained to Moses and Aaron. If only we died at the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, they said, when we ate our fill of bread. For now you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And each day they shall go out and gather enough for that day. As the Lord spoke, the people went out in the morning, and there was a fine layer of dew on the ground that mingled with a sweet substance that they picked up. And here's the important part that I missed. When they picked this substance up, it wasn't just hoarfrost, the dew that comes off the desert floor, but it was some sort of mixture, and it tastes sweet. And they picked it up, and apparently they ate it. And then they said, what is this? Which means in Aramaic, manna. What is this? And they picked it up, and it was called man or manna. What we learn from this story is that there is covering in the Sinai desert a tree called the tamarack tree. And there they drop dew onto the ground that mingles with the dust of the dew that forms a substance that can be eaten. Now, I went into some detail in understanding what is actually dropping from those trees, and we don't want to know. But they ate it. Not only that, they ate it for 40 years. They survived. In the same story you've heard today, in the evening of that day, God rained down quail from the sky. Literally, quail came out of the sky and fell to the ground, and they were able to pick them up and eat them. What I learned is that quail have been on a migratory journey, and the journey was so long over the Sinai desert and so arduous that they literally fell from the sky from exhaustion and were eaten. So there are stories that, if you go deeper into them, they give us a deeper understanding, not only what's going on, but how they managed. If you notice in Psalm 78, the word manna is used. It is a reinterpretation in poetic form of this journey into the wilderness. And so the Israelites would use this particular psalm on those high holy days when they remembered the Exodus event, when they remembered going into the wilderness and having nothing, and God provided dew from the ground, birds from the air. They would remember. And they would remember to this day. If you hear and have heard the last story today in the gospel, the setting is Jesus has fed the 5,000. He is now in the boat heading towards Capernaum with his disciples. He gets there. Some people want more. Does that sound like anybody we know? We want more. And so they travel to Capernaum. And they want signs. They want to know that this is the real McCoy. This is the guy that will save them. So they press upon him. What are you going to do? What signs are you going to perform? And he retorts back, you haven't had your fill with the 5,000? You want more. And he engages them in such a way that takes them to a different level of understanding. Far more than the people in the wilderness, far more than Psalm 78, he takes them in a direction that goes deeper and more fuller and more profound. He says to them, it's not out here that counts, the outward and visible, but what's in here. And I'm sure they scratched their heads. He said, the bread of life God will give you. He will give you manna with bread of life. Not out there, but in here. He was obviously talking about his own life. I am the bread of life. I am the manna. Not what you can fill with your stomachs, but what you can fill with the Spirit within you, with your mind, your heart, and your soul. That's where you live. If you ask me where I'm hungry, it's not out there as much as in here. Struggling at times and exulting at times to realize that Christ is within me. And there, Christ within me does far more than I can ever imagine. That's the manna. That's who I am. And so we come full circle. We see that Christ does feed the 5,000. But probably more profoundly, he feeds all of us, not simply with food for our bodies, but food for the soul. And that's where I think we really live. Ultimately, that's where we really live. There's 3 lessons that I picked up in these particular stories. One is God provides. And if you ever think about it, doesn't God provide exactly what we need? Not maybe what we think we need, but exactly what we need when we need it at the exact time. I find it amazing that we need to trust God. Not simply with the outward and visible, but with the inward and spiritual. The other thing that I noticed in the Exodus story is that the people complained, and the Israelites at the time, they were good at complaining. They did a good job of that. Even though they were rescued from slavery, they still complained. But they didn't look back. If you notice in the story of Exodus, they look forward. And in looking forward, God was before them. The radiance of God was before them. What does that say for myself? How often do I look back rather than point my life forward? The regrets that I make rather than the hope that I have for the future. And thirdly, the Eucharist that we undertake, that we share each week, that is at the central of our life together as Christians. It is not about nourishing our bodies. It is about that spiritual nourishment that I feel, and I sense you feel, you need to sustain your lives in Christ. And that's exactly what Christ was getting at. The other thing that I wish we would do, but it's impossible. Have you ever read the Lord's Prayer other than in church on Sunday? I know if you read the Lord's Prayer on Sunday or recite it, it goes fast, right? Yes? No. I had a person in my last parish who thought we needed to slow down the Lord's Prayer and say each verse very slowly. And I tried it a couple weeks and then we sped up again. But if you read the part that says, "Give us this day our daily bread," my sense is we think of the food for our stomachs that sustains our lives physically. But the early church saw it as words of manna that was given from Christ to his disciples for the Last Supper, and subsequently for our use, that we share in the victory of Christ in his death and resurrection. And in that, we are nourished. And so, give us this day our daily bread. Could be about the Spirit within us being nourished by the very presence of Christ in our lives.